All right. So in today's video, I'm going to be looking at a video called Against Utilitarianism in Ethics and Politics, Net Happiness is Irrelevant. It's by the same person that I reviewed last time, a guy named Eisel. And the reason why I'm reviewing this isn't because I have some interest in particular in this particular, content creator. It's just that he happens to be talking about a subject that I care about. And like last time, there's a lot of just sort of misunderstandings about basic concepts in ethical theorizing that I'd just like to move in and kind of correct. Again, I don't want to make a mean video. I'm not trying to suggest that this guy isn't worth listening to, or that he doesn't have good points, or that you shouldn't follow him or whatever. I haven't seen a whole lot of his things, but I imagine that he has some pretty good points. It's just to say that on this particular narrow topic of ethical theory, there are quite a lot of pretty fundamental misunderstandings, and I want to just kind of move us forward in the dialectic a little bit. So, without any further ado, I'm going to move over and discuss this video. So let's take a look.
Claim about this whole category of moral philosophy, the whole ethical and political approach of utilitarianism, is not that it's meaningless, but that it is irrelevant to ethical questions, to questions of right and wrong, questions of whether or not we should do the right thing just because it's the right thing to do.
Now,
All right, so I have no idea who this guy is. So far, we've gotten a couple of different distinctions. Is utilitarianism a meaningful theory? Then there's, is it relevant? And then there's, is it true or false? I don't know why anybody would think that Eisel is claiming that utilitarianism is meaningless. At least in his last video, he seemed to be suggesting that it's a perfectly meaningful theory. I think he just thinks that it's the false theory. But let's see what happens.
the biggest disagreement with Eisel with regard to ethics is in the derivation of his ethics rather than the ethics themselves. So firstly, Eisel dismisses ideas like maximizing net happiness or minimizing suffering as meaningless or worthless. I know we can't accurately measure these things.
Okay, so I have two criticisms of this guy. First is turn your phone sideways. I mean, this aspect ratio doesn't look good on a computer. And the second is that I think I'm going to agree with Eisel on this one, that it's just not correct that Eisel is saying that it's meaningless. His claim is that it's false, or that in this video I assume that it's irrelevant. All right, so let's keep going.
But I think we can estimate them, and these estimations are essential to ethical judgments and arguments.
So my claim is that the sphere of deontology, sphere of ethical philosophy and making decisions about...
Okay, wow. All right. So it looks like what he's doing right off the bat is conflating deontology with ethics, or saying that the sphere of ethics includes all and only the sphere of deontology. And if he's making that claim, it's kind of a bizarre claim. But we'll keep going and we'll see what's going on.
What we're going to do is separate from, is not overlapping with the sphere in which we could ask in a meaningful and useful way these questions about net happiness.
Okay, I think what he's saying, I think he's making this conflation between ethics as a field and deontology. If that's what he's doing, we're going to have to do like a basic ethics lesson. But I want to give him a little bit more time to talk so that we can sort of find out whether that's what's going on.
Torture. The military and the police using torture. Is it ethically acceptable to torture one person in order to extract information, in order to compel a confession that could save the lives of 100 people? So, typical scenario, still today in 2019, the police or the military are asking themselves whether or not they should torture someone who is a suspected terrorist, because there is the possibility that this will reveal information that will save 100 people's lives, that will prevent a terrorist attack. Okay? This is an ethical question. This is a matter of deontology. This is a matter of right and wrong. This is a matter of doing the right thing because it's the right thing to do. So from my perspective, this kind of pleasure-pain calculus, which is the original terms used by John Stuart Mill, this idea of net happiness is totally irrelevant. Okay? Either
Oh, we'll see what he
procedurally
says.
torture is correct or incorrect.
Okay, yeah, I think he is making this conflation. So we have to talk a little bit about like ethical theory in general. I think before we do that, though, I think what he's doing is something like this. I think he's saying, I think he's making the following argument: calculating overall happiness is irrelevant to deontological assessments of the rightness or wrongness of an act. And maybe a better way of could just make it a little more clear, calculating overall happiness is irrelevant to what deontologists do when they're assessing the rightness or wrongness of an act. Therefore, I'll make this calculating overall happiness is irrelevant to ethics. So first thing we need to note is that this argument is invalid. Even if this premise is true, that's not enough to guarantee that this premise is true. And the reason is that we haven't been told that deontology is the correct theory. There are other theories of how ethics works. So for example, let's see, here is Russ Schaefer-Landau's book. I think it was called Fundamentals of Ethics. And we get a look at consequentialism. So it says consequentialism says that an action is morally required just because it produces the best overall results. Right? Consequentialism is a family a rival family of theories to deontological theories. They're both theories of ethics. So in order to show that something is irrelevant to ethical reasoning, it's not simply enough to show that it's irrelevant to deontological reasoning. You have to also show that it's irrelevant to consequentialist reasoning, right? But there's this other question. And this other question is the calculations of happiness, of these results, is that actually irrelevant to deontological reasoning? And the reason why I want to ask that is like, okay, let's help them out a little bit. Let's turn this into a valid argument and then see if it's sound. So let's go back to the other screen. Deontology is the correct ethical theory. And I'm going to go back to the earlier formulations. And I'm just going to even make it even simpler. Deontology is the correct ethical theory. Therefore, calculating overall happiness is irrelevant to ethics. You might want to tighten this up a little bit, but it's now we have a valid argument. The question is this even true, right? Is it the case that calculating overall happiness is irrelevant to deontology? And the answer is no, it's not. Absolutely not. Let's take a look at some deontological theories. So here is Sir William David Ross, and I'm going to read a little bit. This is from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article on William David Ross's philosophy. So W.D. Ross was a deontologist, and he thought that there were 5 duties, each of which rests on a separate and distinct ground, and each of which specifies a factor which counts in favor of or against an act. So we have a duty of fidelity, to keep our promises. We have a duty of reparation, duty to right a previous wrong. A duty of gratitude, which is the duty to return services to those from whom we have in the past accepted benefits. A duty to promote a maximum of aggregate good. And finally, a duty of non-maleficence, or a duty to not harm others. So this is built right into a particular deontological theory, that we have a duty to promote a maximum good. Now you might be wondering, what is deontology, right? How is it the case that this is still a deontological theory if what's included within it is a duty to promote a maximum good? And I want to look back at Russ Schaefer-Lando's definition of consequentialism to answer this question. So consequentialism says that an action is morally required just because it produces the best overall results. If you're a Rossian, you're going to think that sometimes we shouldn't do the thing that brings about the best overall results. So imagine you're in a situation where action A is going to promote a maximum of aggregate good, but it's also going to involve failing to keep a promise. It's also going to involve failing to repay a duty of gratitude. It's also going to involve failing to commit, to satisfy this duty of non-maleficence. So there's this weighing of all these various duties, right? So it's still a deontological theory, because what we're doing is we are rejecting this pure consequentialist approach where we're only trying to promote a maximum of aggregate good. So it's not consequentialist, but it does include this idea of promoting a maximum of aggregate good within the many duties that it has, right? Now, another thing you might be saying is, okay, Aaron, you've pulled out this kind of obscure deontological theory. Eisel isn't a philosopher. It's not really fair to throw that at him. And fair, that's a fair point. So let's look at another deontological theory. Let's look at the most famous one. Let's look at Kantian deontology. All right, so I'm going to pull up, first let's look at Kant's groundwork to the metaphysics of morals. So I'm going to pull up a section. Sorry, I have a cold today. I apologize for the coughing. A section where Kant is talking about some of the duties that we have. Right, so we're just going to go over to the groundwork now, and I'll just read. So he goes, yet a fourth duty, for whom things are going quite well, while he sees that others, whom he could very well help, have to contend with great hardships, thinks, what is it to me? Let each be as happy as heaven wills, or as he can make himself. I shall take nothing from him, nor even envy him. Only I do not care to contribute anything to his welfare or to his assistance in need. Now, if such a way of thinking were to become a universal law, the human race could admittedly very well subsist. No doubt even better than when everyone prates about sympathy and benevolence and even exerts himself to practice them occasionally, but on the other hand also cheats where he can, sells the right of human beings or otherwise infringes upon it. But although it is possible that a universal law of nature could very well subsist in accordance with such a maxim, so those maxims don't help anybody else, it is still impossible to will that such a principle hold everywhere as a law of nature. For a will that decided this would conflict with itself, since many cases could occur in which one would need the love and sympathy of others, and in which, by such a law of nature arisen from his own will, he would rob himself of all hope of the assistance for which he wishes. We get a little bit of a more clear interpretation of this in a paper by Honora O'Neill. I'll just quote that really quickly. So she writes, the ground of duties of beneficence are that such acts not merely don't use others as mere means, but are acts that develop or promote others' ends, and that in particular foster others' capacities to pursue ends, to be autonomous beings. Right? So we have this idea that, oftentimes we're doing fine, but there's others who are facing great hardships. And we have this duty to contribute to their welfare and assistance when they're in need. Like Kant is rejecting this position that we don't have such a duty. Now, this is an imperfect duty, right? So in Kant's theory, it's very different than a utilitarian who says that we should maximize like aggregate happiness. Kant is not saying that. All Kant is saying is that we have some imperfect duty to go out and help people and try to, improve the welfare of others. He frames it, just to look back here, he frames it in terms of happiness. He frames it in terms of welfare, right? And so it's just not the case that the Kantian is going to, hold this position that calculations of happiness are completely irrelevant to figuring out what we should be doing when we're engaging in ethical reasoning, right? It's a more complicated story because Kant wants us to act out of duty rather than simply to act out of instinct. So if I'm just trying to pursue, or our own selfish good. So like if I'm somebody who's just trying to help others because I think it's going to benefit only me, I'm constantly going to say that's not like a morally good act. I need to be acting out of my duty to help others, right? But it can still be part of our imperfect duties to help others, to make them more happy. So the point that I want to make is that on deontology, it's just not true that calculating overall happiness is irrelevant. It's just not true. On William David Ross, we have this as an explicit duty within his list of duties. And then even within Kant, it's not this thing where we're trying to promote the maximum of aggregate good, but there is still this imperfect duty to foster the ends of others, including to promote their happiness, right? So the claim that Eisel is making, which is that calculating overall happiness is irrelevant to deontology, is just false, right? So I think that we can reject this first premise. And the second premise, deontology is the correct ethical theory, isn't defended. At least we haven't seen it defended yet, right? Okay, so let's keep going and see what happens.
Either this person is innocent until proven guilty and has the right to a trial and the right to remain silent, or they do not. I mean, there are all kinds of ethical questions to be asked here, and even procedural and bureaucratic and legal. Okay, but there is no question to be asked. There is no salience. There is no relevance of taking this abstract equation whereby you have an imaginary amount of pleasure and enjoyment, and then you subtract the amount of suffering and pain, and then ask, well, how much is left over? Is it a positive or negative number at the end of the equation?
So it's not clear to me why he's talking about an imaginary amount of pleasure and pain. What would be going on in that calculation is we figure out how much good it would take, like it would be caused to torture to commit the act of torture. So I don't know where the imaginary thing is coming from, but let's keep going.
Absolutely, by definition, any evil whatsoever can be justified by this equation. Now, net happiness. Think about the meaning of the word net. It's like net profit. Okay? So net profit. You earn a certain amount of money, and it costs you a certain amount of money. You lose a certain amount of money. So you subtract the losses from the profits, and what do you get? You get the net income, net profit, what have you. Okay? In the same way, you're talking about some posited quantity of happiness or enjoyment or well-being, and then subtracting the misery, the harm, the torture, the suffering you inflict, whatever it may be. Any evil whatsoever can be justified this way, including killing cows in order to eat their flesh. There's no end to it. Okay.
Okay, so I think that we need to be really careful when we're talking about the difference between any evil could be justified and any evil is justified. Okay, I think that one thing that Eisel is criticizing, and one thing where he and I are on absolutely the same page about, is that people often engage in utilitarian reasoning to justify really bad behavior. There's a lot of really, and I talked to my philosophy contemporary moral issue students about this also. We talked about this for a little bit a couple days ago. A lot of these ethical theories are really dangerous because when you learn them, what you are learning are moves you can make to try to justify your really bad behavior. You can do this with deontology too. There might be certain situations where it would be kind of like a really good thing to tell a little white lie. But if you're really committed Kantian and you're really committed to like Kantian deontology, you might be convinced that you should never do that, and maybe you don't want to tell the lie, right? But you should. So the point is that for all these ethical theories, there are ways that we could misapply them to real life cases in order to make it seem like we're justifying really bad things. But once we actually look at the real world, it's just not going to be the case that eating cows is going to be justified by utility calculus. So as a utilitarian, I can think that, yeah, maybe there could be some bizarre situation where eating a cow would be morally justified, right? So maybe if it's the case that if I eat maybe some aliens come to Earth and they say, if you eat this one cow, then we will liberate all cows, or something bizarre like that, like these science fiction-y scenarios. Then I think, yeah, maybe it would be justified. I'd be justified in doing it. But in the real life situations that we find ourselves, it's not justified, right? So we have to really distinguish between could be justified in some bizarre possible world and is justified in the actual world. Okay, let's keep going.
What about taking taxpayers' money to build a casino? Right? There's suffering caused by a casino. Poor people are going to get poorer. People are going to lose money. People's lives are going to be destroyed by gambling addiction. There's also the actual use of resources of taxpayers' money when you could have been building something else, these negative things. But then who can quantify the enjoyment? Who can quantify how much happiness this casino will bring to the people?
Okay, so now he's making a very different criticism of utilitarianism, which is that it's hard to calculate utility, right? So the claim is ethics is hard. And I think that is a fair criticism if utilitarianism were a theory of practical deliberation. So if the utilitarians said, okay, every time we want to figure out what to do, we need to sit down and figure out the exact amount of utility caused by this action, then I think it would be a really difficult challenge. But as I talked about in my last video, utilitarianism was not a theory of practical deliberation. It's a theory about the rightness of actions. And good utilitarians from as far back as Jeremy Bentham have known that calculating utility isn't always the best way of maximizing utility. That's why John Stuart Mill said that for any fundamental principle of morality, you need secondary principles to apply them. This is in the very beginning of his book, Utilitarianism, right? So it might be that we look at gambling and we look at the ways that it affects people. And after looking at all this and after studying this for years, we come up with some general principle like don't use taxpayer money to fund gambling, because we find that in general it makes people like worse off, right? It might be that just sort of like throughout history we come up with general principles like that, and then that allows us to make quicker judgments when we're figuring out what to do with taxpayer money. It might also be the case that we find that in general it makes sense to let people vote on how they want proposals like that to go. Right. So there's all these other sorts of procedures that we can use as utilitarians that don't force us to sit down and calculate utility like Eisel is suggesting that utilitarians would want to do. To think that utilitarians always sit down and calculate all, the overall good associated with each action that they're considering is simply to conflate a theory of rightness with a theory of practical deliberation. All right, let's keep going.
How much entertainment and gambling, and maybe there'll be music and dancing and alcohol and cigars, and there's going to be a fancy hotel. You can inflate in your own mind's eye, in your imagination, in your estimate, the supposed pleasure being created by this casino, and it can justify any amount of pain. What about torturing someone to death in order to build a casino? What are the units of this calculus?
So Eisel is expressing some confusion at what it would be like to calculate it, whether it would be good to torture somebody to build a casino. I also am confused about that, but I don't see that as a problem for utilitarianism. I see that as like just kind of like a bizarre supposition that isn't well connected to any particular moral argument. All right, let's keep going.
It's completely surreal. Now, again, coming back to my original premise here, I'm not actually claiming that this line of reasoning is completely meaningless or completely useless.
Good.
I think it is only meaningful and useful when we're entirely outside of the domain of these ethical questions. So to give an example...
Let's just go back for a bit. So one example that he talked about earlier was the example of torture. Right, and there's a well-known problem within political philosophy called the problem of dirty hands. And basically, the idea is that there could be some situations where you have to commit a moral crime in order to bring about the most amount of good. And it's like a real ethical dilemma where either way you're doing something really bad. So it might be a situation where somebody has planted a bomb in a city, and if it goes off, it's going to kill millions of people. Do you torture the person who knows where the bomb is to try to get that information from them, or do you just refuse to torture them, right? I think that's a really tricky situation because on the one hand, I think we should condition ourselves to think that torture is just like wrong and that we shouldn't do it and that it shouldn't be this tool in our toolkit, and that to torture somebody is to commit a really strong moral crime. But on the other hand, I think that if we're talking about saving millions of lives, like an entire city, then it might be nevertheless the best thing to do to engage in torture in that circumstance. Now, I think that most people, when they hear this example, have that sort of same intuition, at least at first. Maybe afterwards they agree with some theorists who would say that there is actually no dilemma. You should just torture the person. But I think most people at least see a conflict there, and they see it as a real moral conflict, right? And so to suggest that these questions about overall happiness are just irrelevant to ethical reasoning, even setting aside the whole discussion of deontology from earlier, just doesn't seem to fit with our basic intuitions about ethics and just our basic reflections about these ethical cases, right? Okay, so let's go on to his example. So he's going to talk about using overall happiness considerations in domains outside of ethics, right?
If you have a museum and you're going to put on an exhibition of art, like you're going to do this anyway, it's already been established. Let's say the government assigned a certain budget. The government says, okay, you have $10 million to put together an art exhibition. Now, do you want to put on an exhibition of ancient Egyptian art or 17th century French art? Or do you want to do an exhibition on dinosaurs? Let's just say hypothetically, this museum, you're going to use the same gallery, you got $10 million. In this context, it may be that it's meaningful to ask about net happiness. It may be meaningful to think in utilitarian terms, like, well, do people here really care about...
Again, every time he does this, I'm going to point this out. He's, again, conflating a theory of right action with a theory of moral deliberation.
Ancient Egypt, how many people will attend this? How many people will enjoy this? Maybe also, what is the educational value? I mean, okay, a lot of children like dinosaurs, but are they really going to learn anything if we do another dinosaur exhibition, as opposed to the educational value of talking about ancient Egypt or something? There can be contexts like this where I think ethical and political questions are frankly banal, where this kind of pleasure-pain calculus, this kind of concept of net happiness may be meaningful. If it is a foregone conclusion that the government is going to build a sports stadium.
Okay, so good. What I would want to add here is that it's not simply these, like, okay, suppose like I'm a utilitarian and I'm trying to figure out whether to do the dinosaur exhibit or the French art exhibit. I'm not simply going to be asking about happiness. I'm also going to be asking about things like beauty. I'm going to have all these aesthetic questions. What is going to be more beautiful? What is going to be more beautiful in my city, sort of in the context of all these other things that are going on in the city, right? So I guess this is just to say that even in the situation where I think he's trying to sort of throw a bone to the utilitarian and say that we can only, it would be appropriate to just ask about like happiness and pleasure. It also makes sense to think about these other things that a utilitarian can include within their theory of deliberation, including considerations of beauty. Okay, let's keep going.
So for whatever reason, there's $100 million that'll go into building the sports stadium. There's no question about that. There's no option here to take the $100 million and instead feed homeless people. $100 million have been set aside to build a sports stadium. And then you were going to ask the question, should we build a basketball stadium or should we build an ice hockey arena with this budget? So you can imagine that may be a context in which you are really asking questions that very closely resemble net happiness. You're going to look at, okay, how many people within this city, how many people really enjoy hockey? How many enjoy basketball? What are going to be the impacts on these sports and for people as spectators and as athletes? Maybe what's going to be the impact on the local university or something? So there are contexts in which the greatest happiness of the greatest number of people is a meaningful question and can even be a useful metric, and where we can agree on even the units that make up the total number in this calculus. Like, it may be the unit is how many people would buy tickets to attend a sports event or to go to a museum or to see a movie. There may actually be arithmetically real, measurable units of human enjoyment involved, and we may be able to think in these terms.
Good. One thing to point out is that I'm not sure if he's making this mistake, but a lot of times people will conflate utilitarianism. Economists are particularly guilty of this, and people who teach philosophy, introduction to ethics classes sometimes do this too. They'll conflate money with utility, right? And that's not the case. Money produces utility, and it produces it with diminishing marginal returns. And I point that out just because I think that if we're going to be talking about utilitarianism and we're going to be talking about evaluating proposals based on the economic impact of those proposals, we just have to keep in mind that money doesn't equal utility. Money is related to utility, and it can make us happier, but it isn't itself happiness. All right.
What's bizarre and tragic and surreal is that this ultimately misguided economistic way of thinking, it's a pseudo-economic way of thinking, has been applied to questions in political science, politics, ethics, morality.
Not by so the pseudo-economic way of thinking is where I guess it's the point I just made, where you see money as like a stand-in for utility. And that's not a mistake that philosophers working on utilitarianism do, right? This might be a mistake that some people are making, but I don't think it's a problem for like the real utilitarians out there who take a real interest in studying what Mill was actually talking about. But I think that this is one place where Eisel and I can get on the same page. I'm so sick and tired of people doing the pseudo-economic calculation and calling that utilitarianism. So I applaud this aspect of the video.
It's been applied to questions where it has absolutely no validity.
Okay, cool. So I hope this was helpful. Again, I think that I'm really glad that this video was made, because I think it gave us a really good opportunity to kind of like sort through the nitty-gritty details of the ethical theories involved. Hopefully I was able to clarify some of the misconceptions and misunderstandings about ethical theorizing, and looking forward to making some more videos. So, let me know what you think, and hope everybody has a nice day. And I also apologize for, I guess it's not really an apology. I have a cold. That's why my voice sounds like this. Sorry if that was annoying. And hopefully that won't be the case in the future.